Hi, welcome back to Cosmic and Body Horror. If you enjoy my content, please consider hitting the like button. It's the only way the YouTube algorithm notices me. Richard Franklyn Searight was an American author and correspondent of HP Lovecraft's. Searight wrote a few stories set in the Cthulhu Mythos, and many of his works were published in pulp magazine Weird Tales. He was the creator of the ancient mystic writings known as the Eltdown Shards, which were later used by Lovecraft in The Challenge from Beyond, although the two authors created divergent histories for the texts. Richard was the father of the late Franklyn Searight, who wrote a significantly larger proportion of mythos pieces than his father, and appears to have attempted to complete some of the elder Searight's unfinished works. The Brain in the Jar by Richard F. Searight and Norman Elwood Hammerstrom. First published Weird Tales, November 1924. For the fifth time in less than an hour, the call bell clanged noisily. Automatically, Vern Eldridge, the orderly, rose from his chair and slipped silently down the dim-lit corridor of the old Berlin hospital. Merely another fretful patient demanding attention. Eldridge sighed. He possessed an adventure-loving soul and a capacity for daring which, during the war, had helped to make him one of the most trusted and efficient members of the American intelligence department, and which naturally enough chafed mightily under the monotony of his present forced inaction. Not that his position even now was sufficiently dangerous. Eldridge was well aware that he had escaped the Wilhelmstrasse agents by what seemed a miracle. He knew that as long as they believed him to be in Germany, and thus far there had been absolutely no opportunity for escape, they would be constantly on the alert for his capture and arrest. Though the armistice had been signed, Eldridge well knew that one who had done so much as himself toward the downfall of the Kaiser's forces would have earned the private vengeance of the imperialists. Even now he was convinced from certain veiled remarks that Dr. Jaeger, the physician in charge, suspected his secret. Eldridge was treading on very thin ice and was fully aware of the fact. He had been employed as an orderly in the hospital for nearly 2 months now, posing as a wounded German soldier of whose papers he had possessed himself, and he knew that it was only a matter of time before the ruse would be discovered. It was well into March of 1919. The night was cold and foggy, and fitful gusts of rain were dashed against the windows by the high wind which had come up at sunset. The gale moaned and shrieked among the towers and turrets of the ancient pile, which trembled slightly under the heavier shocks. A fitting night for murder and crime of all sorts, thought the impressionable Eldridge as he sleepily made his way back to his room. As he approached the stairs leading to the basement, he perceived Dr. Jaeger himself standing beside them in a rather listless attitude. Although it was 3 o'clock in the morning, it was nothing unusual for the famous scientist and research worker to keep even later hours in his private laboratory. At present, he was standing relaxed, smoking a cigarette, and no doubt planning his next day's research program. A slender, erect man of medium height was the doctor, with sharp, strong features accentuated by a neatly trimmed black beard. Rumors were afloat in scientific circles regarding certain experiments successfully carried out by Jaeger in the preservation of living tissues in special liquids. Although as yet, he had given out nothing to the world. The doctor had previously come into renown from several chemical innovations pertaining to the composition of some of the poison gases used by the German armies, which he had perfected during the war. At present, his position at the hospital was a sinecure to aid him in carrying on extensive investigations in tissue preservation. So much Eldridge knew from the report of a fellow operative, since deceased. From his own observation, he knew Jaeger to be a cold, hard man, utterly without scruples, and having a deep vein of cruelty in his nature, which manifested itself from time to time in various characteristic acts. As Eldridge passed, the doctor gave him a short good morning and turned to descend the stairs. Doubtless, thought Eldridge, he was going to the basement for chemicals, having perhaps run out of some compound needed to complete the experiment which had kept him working so late. Eldridge passed on and was turning down the corridor leading to his own room when, above the roar of the wind and steady beat of the rain, a door slammed loudly. For a moment, he failed to perceive its significance. Then he pulled up sharply and listened, for it dawned upon his sleepy mind that the noise had come from behind a door which he had always supposed to open on a fire escape. This was curious indeed, and his mind became instantly alert as he realized the possible significance of his discovery. His professional training and natural curiosity overcoming his caution, Eldridge stepped to the door and turned the knob. The door proved to be unlocked, and he entered quickly, closing it behind him. He found himself in a narrow hallway lit dimly by a single bulb in the ceiling. Fully resolved now to investigate the mystery of this part of the building, Eldridge passed quickly to the end of the corridor, where he found it turned sharply to the left. A few yards farther on, he arrived at a second door, doubtless, he thought, the one which had slammed. He opened it cautiously and slipped in, the draft closing it after him. He was in a fairly large room fitted up as a laboratory. A drop light on one of the two large tables cast a circle of bright light over the table, leaving the rest of the room in deep shadow. As his eyes became accustomed to the shaded light, he saw that the place was lined with shelves holding row after row of chemical supplies, as well as numerous glass containers of various sizes and shapes. These latter were filled with liquids in which floated, in perfect preservation, various parts of the human anatomy. The tables were littered with retorts, test tubes, Bunsen burners, microscopes, surgical and dissecting instruments, in fact all the varied paraphernalia of the research chemist and physiologist. On the left was a small anteroom, and beside it, projecting partly in front of its doorway, was a large cage containing several full-grown guinea pigs. An expensive X-ray outfit and various photographic apparatus stood in one corner. It flashed on Eldridge's mind that he had stumbled on the private laboratory of Dr. Jaeger. He had never known the exact location of this room, and the doctor always entered it from his private office, which he invariably kept locked during his absence. No doubt, thought the spy. The anteroom led to the office. He quickly realized that his presence here was not without considerable danger, for the scientist would hardly have taken such elaborate precautions in regard to the privacy of his laboratory had he not had something to conceal. Eldridge began to feel decidedly nervous. The violently raging elements without did not help to dispel this feeling. He had almost decided to retire and leave his investigation for a more favorable time, when his attention was arrested by a large glass jar resting on a shelf above the rows of drugs and chemicals on the right wall. It caught his eye first through the elaborate apparatus connected with it, then by its contents. The jar was spherical in shape, with a large circular mouth fitted with a ground glass stopper, having a German cross for a knob. Above was a large nickel-plated tank, and extending from it to the jar was a slender glass tube controlled by a system of valves. Another tube, also fitted with valves, projected from the jar close to the base, disappearing into the wall. Both tubes were fitted with delicate thermometers. Eldridge observed most of these details later. At present, his attention was riveted upon the contents of the jar, which seemed to consist of a purple-black fluid. As he stared, the hue gradually changed to a deep red and slowly became clear. Then, in the depths of the jar, the amazed spy beheld two glowing red spots, gleaming through the murky liquid like the eyes of a wolf in the dark. Then, as the fluid became perfectly transparent, he saw what appeared to be two naked human eyes glaring down at him with ferocious intensity. He fell back aghast, staring in amazement at this phenomenon, and as he looked, the liquid slowly resumed its former opacity till it had regained the original purple-black hue. Then it again grew transparent, and the whole phenomenon was repeated. 3 times Eldridge witnessed this curious change. Then, gathering his courage, he climbed up on the table nearer to the jar so that he was but a few feet from it, with his eyes on the same level. As the liquid cleared once more, he saw a human brain in perfect preservation, resting on a soft membranous cushion. The cushion lay on a glass pedestal which projected about halfway up from the bottom of the jar. Extending from the brain were 2 cords, which crossed each other and dropped to the bottom of the jar, terminating in the 2 human eyes that Eldridge had first seen in the semi-darkness of the laboratory. The hideous spectacle resembled a huge snail. Eldridge had lost track of the time since entering the strange and sinister laboratory of Dr. Jaeger, but now his subconscious alert senses detected the sound of a door slamming far down the outer corridor. It must be the doctor returning from the basement, Eldridge thought, and he hastily slipped from the table and out into the narrow hallway, being careful this time that the door did not slam. As he reached the door opening into the outer corridor, he heard footsteps rapidly approaching and slipped behind the door just as the doctor entered. Jaeger closed the door without a backward glance and hurried down the corridor. He passed the corner without turning his head, but Eldridge waited until he heard the sound of the laboratory door closing, and then hurried to his room. What he had witnessed in Dr. Jaeger's secret laboratory had made a deep impression upon Eldridge, but it was some time before he had another opportunity to visit the weird room. The doctor always kept both doors locked, and doubtless only the late hour, and his intention to return at once had caused him to relax his vigilance on the night Eldridge made his first visit. Furthermore, he was nearly always there in person, working on his endless experiments. But finally, after nearly 3 weeks, Jaeger was called to Carlsbad for a consultation, and Eldridge realized that his chance for closer investigation had come. He waited until after midnight. Then, making sure that he was not observed, he unlocked the doors with skeleton keys and entered the laboratory. He found it very much as he had left it on his previous visit, except that the place was in total darkness. He located the switch by means of his pocket flash and turned on the visible drop light. He had ascertained after his first visit that the room contained no windows that might show the illumination to anyone passing by outside, and in view of the doctor's absence, he thought himself fairly safe from interruption. He had brought a pad of paper and a pencil, and now seated himself on the table in order to bring his eyes nearer to the level of the jar, and proceeded to make a rapid sketch of the jar and its contents. As he was putting the final touches to the drawing, he had a distinct and vivid impression that his name had been called. His auditory nerves had registered nothing. Of that he was certain, but the impression was too real to be lightly dismissed. He glanced nervously about, but no other living thing was present, aside from the guinea pigs in their cage. Again came that vivid impression of his name being pronounced. He looked up to see the glaring eyes of the brain fading gradually from sight as the liquid in the jar grew opaque. As he stared, the fluid again regained its transparency and the glowing eyes seemed to be boring through his very brain. His head swam, he clutched at the table for support and then lost consciousness. He returned to his senses as from a black void, with all the mental sensations of emerging from ether. He had no means of telling the length of time that had passed during his trance. But glancing at his watch, he saw that it was only a little after 1 o'clock, so he concluded that it must have been brief. Then, looking down at his sketch, he saw a line in French written across the bottom in his own handwriting. He was considerably surprised, not to say alarmed, and with a final glance at the eyes, now disappearing into the liquid, he turned to the door. Suddenly he stopped with a gasp of terror. Suspended motionless in thin air, before his eyes hung an empty test tube. As he shrank back, the tube dropped and crashed to pieces on the floor. Retaining only enough presence of mind to switch out the light, Eldridge ran from the laboratory, more frightened by this than by any other of the phenomena which he had witnessed. Translated, the message on his sketch proved to read, Be in the laboratory tomorrow at midnight. Brief and to the point, thought Eldridge, and he gave much thought during the day to the curious communication. He saw Dr. Jaeger returning from his consultation late in the afternoon, and with some misgivings he repaired to the laboratory at midnight, armed with an automatic. He found the room empty. Jaeger, tired by his journey, had retired early. Seated again before the brain, the spy soon passed into a hypnotic trance precisely similar to the one he had undergone the night before. He emerged as on the previous occasion, as if from a black void, and looking down at his tablet, found that several sheets were closely covered with his handwriting in French. He hastened to his room and began to translate the script. As he proceeded, horror and amazement at the gruesome tale halted him again and again. But he finally completed the task, and the whole weird story lay before him. In the name of the dictator, he recognized that of a famous French spy who had disappeared just before the signing of the armistice. "My name is Jean Perrin," read the script. "Possibly you have heard of me, Mr. Eldridge, for with all modesty I may say that my work did a great deal toward the downfall of the German forces. When I was finally captured and exposed on November 5th of last year, the Wilhelmstrasse officials swore vengeance upon me, peace or no peace. But I knew that my work was well done, and that the end of the war could be but a few days off. Colonel von Uhlmann, head of the Secret Service, had me brought before him for a private interview in which he tried to extract from me full details regarding the extent of the information I had managed to furnish our leaders. Colonel von Uhlmann failed utterly in his purpose, and it enraged him to such an extent that he swore I should die on the day the war ended. I bowed mockingly as I left his presence, but though I never saw him again, he kept his word. All was bustle and confusion preceding the great day, but when it dawned it brought with it a dead quiet, which told me, in solitary confinement, better than any words could have done, that the thing we had waited and worked and died for during more than 4 long years had at last been accomplished. For safer keeping I was confined, not in the Berlin prison, but in a small room in a turret of the old castle of Prince Otto von Machstein just outside Berlin. 2 armed guards stood without my door day and night, and my food was passed to me through a small slide window in the door. They were taking no chances with John Perrin. It is with a little pardonable pride that I recall how carefully they watched me, and their conversation outside my door, which showed how they feared my escape. And it was to good purpose. For them. Much as I plotted, carefully as I searched my mind, there was no possible chance for freedom in the limited time given me. The great day of the armistice found me still a prisoner. Late that night a guard of 8 came clanking down the corridor, their heavy boots raising echoes throughout the old castle. Their leader, a heavy-set, brutal-faced sergeant, unlocked the door for the first time in nearly a week and confronted me with an evil grin on his seared countenance. Perhaps he knew of the fate in store for me. I think so now. I made no resistance as they handcuffed my wrists and led me from the castle. In silence we entered an armored car, and after an hour or more of rapid driving arrived at this hospital. Through the long, dimly lit corridors the clanking guard proceeded and followed me, and finally we reached the operating room. The light was poor here, as elsewhere in the building, but in the center of the room stood the operating table, illuminated by a cold blue cone of light from the powerful electric lamp overhead. The room seemed filled with doctors and nurses, shrouded in white, and at the head of the table stood an instrument tray covered with the glittering paraphernalia of the surgeon. Ah, I shudder as I recall those fearful moments. I was seized and overpowered for, handcuffed as I was, my resistance was feeble. Stripped of my clothes and attired in an antiseptic white gown, I was thrown upon the table and my hands and feet strapped to its legs. My head was strapped down, and then Dr. Jaeger, a cruel smile on his face, he had not yet donned his operating mask like the others, though otherwise in full operating attire, stepped up and addressed me. Oh, the horror of what that snake-blooded demon told me. It rings in my ears even now when I am past all caring. He told me of his successful experiments in keeping alive in his special fluids various parts of the human body. And I was to be the subject of his crowning experiment, an attempt to keep the human brain alive and functioning. Can you imagine the horror of that scene to me, a living, normal man? Can you picture that dim room, its atmosphere heavy with the odors of disinfectants and anesthetics, with the white-robed figures of doctors and nurses, shrouded to the eyes, flitting about silently as ghosts, as they prepared the instruments and anesthetics for this frightful crime? It was almost more than the human mind could endure, and I nearly lost my self-control. Then I read the meaning of the evil grin on Dr. Jaeger's face, and knew that he was waiting for me to break down and beg for mercy. What pleasure so exquisite for him as to refuse it, and perhaps make the torture worse in some way for the mere pleasure of gloating over my suffering? I gritted my teeth and swore that no cry, no sign of quailing, would they wring from me. Dr. Jaeger stared long and piercingly into my eyes. What he saw there must have convinced him of my determination, for he made an abrupt sign of disgust and gave the order for the anesthetic. I held myself rigid and taut as the ether nozzle was placed over my nose and mouth, shutting out from my lungs forever the oxygen that gives life. But I breathed deeply of the lethal fumes, for oblivion was heaven after that scene of hell. I shall never know, I suppose, just how long my consciousness was suspended. I do not think it was more than a few days, but again it might have been weeks. My first sensations were too frightful for description. I can give but a poor idea of the agony I endured. But it was all in one place, seemingly within my cranium. Alas, I did not know then that my cranium was reduced to ashes. 1,000,000 demons might have been stabbing at my brain with red-hot needles. Darkness, a terrible roaring were all about. Is this the end? I thought. Am I in the abode of the damned? For the torture of those moments seemed to me impossible, except in the place taught by the faith of my childhood to be the final home of evil. Thought, concentration were impossible. I have only the memory of the sensations. The noise increased, grew unbearable. A cracking, shrieking roar, mounting higher and higher, seemed about to split the eardrums I no longer had. Then oblivion for another indeterminate period. With returning consciousness, the symptoms gradually subsided, and at length I was able to observe an alternate change of light to darkness and darkness to light, occurring about once every 2 minutes. During the light periods I became able to distinguish objects, and slowly I regained my normal power of vision. I saw that I was in a large and fully equipped laboratory, the room in which you are sitting tonight. But what was my horror to perceive in a mirror on the opposite wall, not myself as I had been in life, but this glass jar wherein you see me, and within it my own brain and eyeballs attached thereto by their nerve cords. And then I knew that Jaeger's accursed experiment had succeeded. My living brain, was functioning in his liquid. Far better, I thought, had death claimed me. From then on I lived in a world devoid of all sensations of sound, odor, or feeling. My first terrible agonies had been due to the irritation of the ends of the severed spinal cord and sensory nerves. Nothing was left me now but my sense of sight, thanks to the surgical skill of that ingenious fiend. The eternal silence was oppressive, maddening. I prayed for death in vain, for I possessed no material body with which to execute self-destruction. My mind and personality were helplessly chained to this lump of clay called the brain. Then I found something to live for. Every day the doctor comes to work long hours at his experiments, sometimes with chemicals, test tubes and retorts, sometimes with tissue and microscopes, or again with strange photographic apparatus. And every night before he leaves, he comes and stares at me for many minutes. He knows that the tissue of my brain lives, but as yet he has found no way of determining whether or not it functions. And it pleases me to keep him in ignorance, for the day of my vengeance is very near. That is what I have found to live for. I have learned a great deal since my incarceration here. Among other things, that Dr. Jaeger, whatever may be his nature and personal character, is one of the world's great scientists, a specialist in many things, in all of which he excels. I have learned, too, something of the manner in which I am kept alive here. The tube leading into the jar from above connects with the nickel tank, which contains a supply of the secret fluid. The valves are arranged to let the fluid pass very slowly through the jar, finding egress through the lower valves and out through the tube which they control. The liquid is nutritious and at body temperature. A subtle periodic chemical reaction causes the color change, designed to protect my naked eyes from the light. Beyond the fact that the fluid has a chemical similarity to human blood and contains a colorless compound carrying oxygen, I have no knowledge of its composition. But I have learned much more than this. With nothing to do, week after week, I have worked at the one thing that was left to me. I have developed my willpower. From the will of an ordinary man, I have increased its strength till my powers now would astound any psychologist, even those who suspect the possibilities of the human will. And I have used it to the harm of the enemy, though my only aim now is my personal vengeance on Jaeger. In the last week there have been 12 murders, 6 suicides and 8 insanity cases, all of noted German officials of the worst type. Among them was Colonel von Uhlmann. These acts were all caused by the hypnotic suggestions which I have made by telepathy. And I have advanced even farther than this. I have done what has never been accomplished before. Today my will is so highly developed that by simply exerting it, I can move small objects. The suspended flask you saw last night was a demonstration. Were I to continue, the time would come soon when nothing would be impossible for me. My powers would be such that I might rule the world through strength of will. But I have no desire for that. Existence is misery, and when I have accomplished my revenge, I shall be glad to leave life in earnest this time. It is by means of my telepathic power that I have thrown you into the hypnotic trance which now claims you, and, using your hand, have written down my story. If you would witness my vengeance on Dr. Jaeger, conceal yourself in the small room behind the guinea pig cage tomorrow night. Be there by 9 o'clock, as Jaeger, whose mind I read, will come soon after. Thus ended a manuscript which surpassed by far in grisly horror, gruesome detail, and stark improbability anything that Eldridge had ever imagined possible. He passed the day as though in a trance, his mind running constantly on the extraordinary communication. He had no doubts, after the first natural questionings of his mind, as to the authenticity of the strange message, and so 9 o'clock found him concealed as directed, with his automatic ready. He had not been long hidden when Dr. Jaeger entered from his office, and without looking around set about his work. He began slicing, for microscopic examination, tissue from a living human arm taken from one of the jars. A half hour or more passed, broken only by an occasional cough or exclamation of satisfaction from the doctor as the examination proceeded, apparently to his complete satisfaction. Eldridge did not grow impatient. The uncanny affair held him enthralled. Then a slight movement above the doctor's head caught his eye. For the first time he noticed a huge wax bottle of hydrofluoric acid on a shelf directly over that section of the table whereon the scientist was. Engaged. Jaeger had been using the deadly stuff for certain silicon determinations of the tissue. Again the slight movement, and now Eldridge saw that it was this bottle sliding forward a few inches. Slowly, all but imperceptibly, so as not to alarm the worker below, it slid forward toward the edge of the shelf. Unconsciously, Eldridge estimated the distance it must fall to reach the doctor, some 5 or 6 feet. Involuntarily he was tempted to warn the unsuspecting physician, but the glittering eyes of the brain seemed to render his will powerless. The bottle was now projecting some inches beyond the edge of the shelf. Eldridge started to cry out, but found himself unable to speak. He tried to rise, but was unable to move a muscle. Suddenly the doctor looked up. perhaps warned by some premonition of his impending doom. If so, it came too late. Into his eyes came the look of a hunted animal as he saw the jar of deadly acid poised directly over his head. The bottle came hurtling downward as he started to rise and struck him full in the face, smashing to bits while the acid gushed over his body. He fell to the floor, writhing and shrieking in his death agony. The vengeance of Jean Perrin was accomplished. Meanwhile, the acid vigorously attacked the woodwork and glassware, and flames soon sprang up from the heat of the reaction. A bottle of sodium exploded, and row after row of bottles came crashing down, their chemical contents adding fuel and impetus to the flames. Eldridge's escape by the corridor had been cut off from the first, and the scene held him fascinated. He made no attempt to leave through the doctor's office as he might have done at first. His present position had become one of great danger, owing to the explosive nature of some of the chemicals which had not yet been touched by the flames. The laboratory was rapidly becoming a raging inferno. High above all stood the jar and its contents which had brought this thing to pass. The red eyes of the brain glittered triumphantly through the smoke and flames. Jaeger had become motionless. Then suddenly the shelf gave way and brain and jar crashed into the fire and disappeared. Long tongues of flame shot up to the very ceiling. Then came a bursting roar. A flying bottle struck Eldridge on the temple and oblivion descended. When Eldridge returned to consciousness, he found himself swathed in bandages on board a hospital ship bound for New York. His wife was with him, also his friend and company worker Felton of the Secret Service, who, with a detachment sent from the American Army of Occupation, had effected his rescue from the burning hospital. To them he related his weird tale, and with shattered nerves and seared body resigned himself to his wife's loving care. Her love alone can efface from his mind the effects of the memory of the vengeance of the brain in the jar. End of The Brain in the Jar by Richard F. Searight and Norman Elwood Hammerstrom. Sealed Casket by Richard F. Searight. First published Weird Tales, March 1935. The icy fingers of a fetor that was old when the world was young reached for the life of the scheming Wesson Clark. A strange little story. Wesson Clark had been studying the sealed casket for nearly an hour, his shrewd black eyes feasting avidly on its crudely carved metal contours. It lay before him in the pool of light from the desk lamp, which illuminated his classic, calculating features with a pallid glow while making a shadowy obscurity of the cavernous, book-lined study. Outside, the high March wind shrilled and plucked with icy fingers at the cornices and gables of the old house. It gave Clark a pleasing, luxurious sense of security to relax in the overheated gloom of the upstairs study and listen to the rising moan without. Careless, slipshod old Simpkins had gone for the night after stoking the ancient furnace to capacity, and Clark was alone in the house as he had wished to be for this occasion. He smiled slightly and hummed a snatch from the latest Gershwin hit as his gaze returned to his prize. The casket was small and compact, perhaps 16 inches long by 6 or 7 wide, and formed of a dull, age-tarnished metal that defied casual identification. The crude, writhing images carved into its surface offered no aid to classification. Clark failed to assign them to any known period of early art. A gratifying legacy to a connoisseur of antiques was this ancient box. Old Martucci had never suspected then. There had been times when Clark had wondered, and feared, as he carried on his surreptitious affair with Martucci's youthful wife. Not that it mattered now. The sinister old scientist, with his perverted sense of humor, was dead, and Nonna, though filled as ever with Latin fire, seemed much less fascinating now that legal barriers were removed. Also, she was growing a bit proprietary, a little too assured. Clark knew the signs. He smiled ironically as he studied the casket. While Martucci lived, Clark had cultivated his friendship and enjoyed the conquest of Nonna at stealthy assignations, employing the greatest caution. But now there was nothing to fear. For the moment at least, he was surfeited with Nonna's charms, and he felt free to discard her as he saw fit, without the haunting dread of discovery and vengeance by the suspicious old archaeologist. Besides, he needed freedom to reel in his new catch, one more alluring than the Italian girl had ever been, and endowed with a fortune that ran into almost mythical figures. His intentions were very serious here. His smile deepened as he recalled the peculiar clause that formed a part of the codicil to the last testament of Martucci, the clause which was the instrument conveying Casket, and I do hereby bequeath to my one-time friend Wesson Clark the ancient coffer of Alutor, and urge him only to leave the leaden seal thereon intact, as I have done for 30 years. Clark chuckled softly. Martucci had been a naive fool in spite of his dubious reputation in scientific circles, where certain ruthless and unethical practices attributed to him were frowned on heavily. He had kept the seal intact, had he? And no guessing what rare treasures of antiquity might be hidden inside. He had spent his life delving in the earth and incidentally acquiring the meagre fortune, now almost dissipated, with which he had retired, while quite possibly real wealth waited in the casket. But then, the Italian had been a strange character, one of those rare, incomprehensible creatures who appear to place little importance on the mere possession of money. The aggrandizement of his name in scientific discoveries, the search for the forbidden in hidden occult lore, the cynical study of human nature, had seemed to mean much more to him. Certainly he had never opened the casket, for the splotch of melted lead that sealed it was black with age, and bore no signs of having been tampered with. With sybaritic indolence, Clark lay back and gloated over his acquisition. He scrutinized more closely the cryptic, wavering symbols, vague and spidery, which had been impressed at some remote time on the laden seal, no doubt while the metal was still hot. They were quite unfamiliar in that they resembled nothing he could recall having seen before, but there was something indefinably disturbing in their almost sentient lines. They brought to mind some utterly impossible living thing. He laughed at the absurdity of the impression. But whatever they represented, the symbols were very old. Their primitive crudeness suggested an antiquity antedating the Phoenician alphabet or even the Mayan inscriptions. Clark regretted his scanty knowledge of such things, for here he half suspect. Ted might lie a specimen of the very first primal writing, the groping pictorial attempt to transcribe thought from which had developed the earliest known written Cherokee. He would preserve the seal intact and have it examined by an authority. Possibly it possessed a definite intrinsic value of its own. Martucci must have known. His knowledge of epigraphy had been profound, and it was whispered that all his developments in that field had not been turned over to science. It was even possible that he had deciphered the inscription, if inscription it were. But in the meantime, Clark intended to open the thing. Certainly he was going to open it. It was quite characteristic of Martucci that, because of some squeamish eccentricity or other, he had refrained from doing so himself. But had he really thought the new owner would use such illogical restraint? Clark chuckled again. Still, it was odd that the Italian had never spoken of the casket, especially as he must have decided on its disposal some months before. The date of the codicil showed that. No doubt a little surprise for the one-time friend, but odd just the same, for it was an object over which the failing scientist, with his wide knowledge of antiquities, and Clark, with his dilettante love for them, might have had many of the discussions the archaeologist had so seemed to enjoy. And that was a strange wording. One time. It almost suggested that Martucci had suspected when he dictated the sentence. But that was impossible. The very assignment of such a rare relic was proof in itself of complete trust and good feeling. After all, the import of the words, intended for reading after the writer's death, was plain enough. Well, there was no need for further delay. He had gloated long enough. His black eyes sparkled greedily as he picked up the heavy brass paper knife from his desk and dug tentatively at the seal. The leaden smear was surprisingly hard. Perhaps it was some strange alloy. He pried harder, finally succeeding in inserting the knife point between the seal and the age-blackened metal of the box itself. The lead refused to bend further. It clung tenaciously to its age-old moorings. At length, Clark left it to rummage about the house for tools. He returned with a hammer and carefully relocked the study's only door before he sat down. He used the knife as a wedge, and at the first blow, the lead peeled neatly away, disclosing a patch of dully shimmering metal beneath. He had not expected to find that the seal covered a keyhole, and nothing of the sort was visible. Evidently, the box was far too ancient for that contrivance. His heart was pounding. He drew an anticipatory breath and pried the knife point under the lid. A little leverage, and it was done. The cover came up. The casket was empty. Clark was genuinely surprised. Strange that the box should be so tightly sealed when it held no contents to be guarded. This lacked plausibility. As he stared in puzzled bewilderment at the burnished inner surface, he became aware of a faint, fetid odor creeping into his nostrils. He sniffed, his nose wrinkling in distaste. Slight though it was, the smell suggested vaguely the charnel emanation from some long-closed tomb. Then came the cold draught. Through the close air of the study, which was gradually becoming oppressively hot, it breathed against his face in a single icy gust, laden with a sudden augmentation of the nauseating odor of putrescence. Then it was gone, and the heated air had closed about him as if nothing had disturbed it. Clark started up, then sank back in the chair. He frowned, staring hard at the door and windows half hidden in the shadowy gloom beyond the circle of lamplight. He knew them to be locked securely, and an uneasy disquiet stirred in his breast as his probing eyes verified the fact. His attention was drawn back to the subtle odor of corruption which had gradually grown stronger. It permeated the room now, a dank, mephitic fetor grotesquely out of place in the quiet study. He rose slowly to his feet, alarm spreading over his features. And as he did so, the icy, noisome chill puffed again upon his face like a breeze from some glacial sepulchre. His head jerked back, and fear dawned in his eyes. Here, in a locked room on the top floor of the old house he had lived in for years, something utterly uncanny, something entirely beyond the realms of sanity, was taking place. Clark started slowly across the study toward the door, then stopped abruptly. A faint sound had come from the shadows at the far side of the room where the heavy Saruk rug stopped short a foot from the wall. It was an insidious, barely audible rustling noise, such a noise as might be made by a great snake writhing along the uncarpeted strip. And it came from between him and the door. Clark prided himself on his cold-blooded imperturbability, but his breath came quickly now, and the wild, unreasoning fear of a trapped animal flooded his mind. Whatever the nature of the thing in the room with him, could he doubt its presence? It was intelligently cutting off his escape. It must be watching his every movement with malignant, brooding eyes. A shudder of stark horror convulsed him at the realization. He stood very still in the center of the study, his mind racing in frenzied, terror-driven circles. A sense of the crowding presence of some bestial, primordial depravity, of overwhelming defilement, surged with paralyzing certainty through his brain. Thoughts of escape were crowded out, the imminence of the danger routed reasoning power. And yet, through the waves of terror that beat through his consciousness, he realized that his life, yes, his very soul, was menaced by an unspeakable cosmic malevolence. With a tremendous effort, he checked the rising, smothering hysteria and succeeded in regaining a partial control of his thoughts. His eyes pierced the gloom ahead and about him. Nothing stirred. What hideously ancient entity had been imprisoned in the casket? He could not guess, nor did he wish to know. But Martucci had known. Martucci, the authority on ancient writings, the delver in hidden lore. Martucci had known everything. He had schemed. Oh, so cunningly, for revenge, and this was the result. If the dead could know, how the old man must be gloating to see his crafty trap closing about his victim. Now Clark felt cold vibrations beating upon him, vibrations of inhuman, impersonal evil. His nerves crawled and shrank as from a loathsome physical contact. He shifted uneasily, and there came the sound of a stealthy, slithering movement toward him across the rug. He backed away until his shoulders bumped against the wall behind him. Still, the soft noises continued, slowly drawing near. They detoured to one side, then to the other, then they were back in front of him, and much closer. His eyes searched the shadows desperately. Empty, formless, mysterious they were, but nothing moved that his physical sight could detect. The lurking menace, its presence proclaimed by every taut nerve in his body, was still invisible. If he could trust his eyes, he was alone in the room. But he felt the close proximity of something cold and yet alive, something which was a definite physical presence, manifesting itself to him through pre-human senses, semi-atrophied by eons of disuse. Whatever it was absorbing the suffocating heat of the room, actually lowering the temperature at a rapid rate. Quite suddenly, the utter horror of the impossible, incredible situation broke through the dam of desperate resistance his mind had built up. Something snapped, and he laughed, a high-pitched cachinnation of rising hysteria that echoed wildly from lips drawn back in a grinning frenzy of terror. He cringed, flinging up his arms in an abject surrender to fear. A torrent of gibbering incoherency pushed the terrible laughter from his lips. The dusky room swam about him, and he did not know that his knees had buckled and that he had plumped forward on them, his arms rigid before his face to ward off the approaching danger. Again came the icy breath, rank with primeval filth, terrifying in its nearness. It passed lightly over his face, making him retch with its overpowering fetor. Then he shrieked once in paralyzed despair, as slender, groping tentacles, cold as outer space, caressed his throat and body, their deathly chills striking through his clothing as if he had been naked. A vast, flabby, amorphous coldness enveloped him. Repulsively soft and bulky it was, but as he struggled it gripped him with the resistless strength of chilled steel. He could feel the regularly spaced vibrations of some utterly alien, incomprehensible life. A life so frightful that he shrieked again and again as its purpose became apparent. Then the murky room whirled about him. He had been whisked up, was staring with starting eyes at the ceiling, through which little flames were eating, while the fetid horror gradually compressed its icy folds. He was falling down, down through endless shafts of icy blackness into a bottomless quagmire of primordial slime. A vast roaring filled his ears. Monstrous phantasms leered through the bursts of flame that punctuated the rushing descent. Then all was silence and blackness and oblivion. Fanned by the high wind, the flames had gutted the old house when the firemen arrived. Little remained to aid the coroner in his investigation. Naturally, he discounted heavily the fantastic testimony of certain early arrivals regarding a high-pitched, agonized whistling sound which they claimed had proceeded from the upper part of the building, and the belching clouds of foul-smelling smoke which had found an exit after the upper floors collapsed and the whistling stopped. Simpkin's admission that he had neglected to close the drafts of the furnace cleared up the cause of the fire, but privately. The coroner was exceedingly puzzled by certain peculiarities that the post-mortem disclosed in the charred and blackened corpse, identified by a dentist as Wesson Clark's. It was surely a matter of wonder that virtually every bone in this body had been broken, as if in the embrace of some gigantic snake of the constrictor species, and it was an insoluble mystery how the veins and organs had been drained of every drop of blood. End of Sealed Casket by Richard F. Searight. Lest you think that the science contained in this story is entirely imaginary, let us point out that one of the most mysterious electrical phenomena of which practically nothing is known is ball lightning. Here we have a phenomenon where electricity, for reasons not dearly understood, forms itself into a 6 to 8 inch fiery globe which sometimes moves slowly, other times with terrific speed. The ball may come in through an open window and move around leisurely. If it comes in contact with anything alive, like a human being or animal, it often kills them on the spot, leaving a strong sulfur odor behind. Well, of course, ball lightning has no intelligence, and is, therefore, not alive in that sense. It still shows how little we know about electrical forces. The author of this tale has no doubt used electrical phenomena of this sort as the basis of this story, and he has woven an exceedingly moving pen picture of what might happen when some electrical force becomes endowed with intelligence. The Cosmic Horror, by Richard F. Searight. First published Wonder Stories 1933. Now that the reign of terror induced by the cosmic horror, as the phenomenon has been repeatedly termed by the press, in Clinton County and the surrounding territory has come to an end, countless inquiries have poured in on me. A scientific monograph has already been published relating such facts as were obtained through the connection of Professor Elton and myself with the activities of the horror. But these findings were necessarily too inadequate to satisfy the many speculations regarding the origin and real nature of the visitant. The worldwide interest in the matter has decided me to set down, simply and concisely, the story of the actual happenings, as seen by a layman who was unfortunate enough to be involved in the affair. The whole frightful train of events began towards the close of my annual summer vacation. For years, I have been accustomed to leave my legal practice in the city and spend this period with Professor Wayne Elton, on his small country estate near Clinton. The professor has been blamed, indeed censured bitterly by some of his colleagues, for his initial part in the matter. Yet I think all will agree that he has made full reparation for the damage wrought by his curiosity. It had been one of those breathlessly hot, muggy evenings, with a thunderstorm in the offing. Even Elton, a man as impervious to heat as anyone I have ever known, was content, for the moment, to relax the bundle of nerves and muscles which composed his lean frame and devote himself to a cigar. Finally the storm broke, and rain fell in torrents. After its passing, we resumed our porch seats, drinking in the refreshing breeze which had sprung up and reveling in the relief from the cloying heat. I thought of the approaching end to my visit, and my eyes roved regretfully over the dim panorama of rolling countryside stretching away under the clean-washed stars. Elton's incisive voice broke in on my reverie. "Look, Creighton, a meteor!" My gaze followed his pointing finger. "Looks as though it would land close to her," I commented lazily. Together we watched the fiery mass rushing earthward. It was close. Indeed, so close we could almost feel the rush of air disturbed by its swift descent. "Unless I'm all wrong, it fell in the field just across the highway from us," said Elton after a moment, running a restless hand through his greying hair. "No detonation, so it must have landed in one piece. This is luck. I've always wanted a meteorite of my own to analyze. It ought to be easy enough to find," he continued. "No moon tonight, but I think I know just about where it struck. I'll rout out old Jenkins to help us look. Come along." With his usual impetuousness, he was already on his way to the back of the big house. I followed at the best pace my waistline would permit, reflecting that the years since we had been roommates at the university had made little inroad on his dynamic energy. Our search did not meet with success, quite as soon as Elton appeared to expect, but an hour later found the three of us grouped about the meteorite. It was a fair-sized one, a foot in diameter, and recognizable only by the black fused crust, thin and glossy, which covered it. It lay nearly buried in the loam of the field where it had fallen in a natural hollow of the ground, causing it to escape detection for a time. Jenkins, the aging gardener and utility man of the estate, set down his lantern. "There's a hoist in the garage that we can use," he told us. "I'll bring it over on the little truck, if you want." "All right," approved the scientist. "Do that. We'll dig the stone out and take it back on the truck. Then The meteorite, a remarkably symmetrical one, was soon in place in the back of the pickup truck. It was strangely lacking in weight. In fact, I believe we could have carried it to the house between us. This phenomenon whetted Elton's already keen curiosity, and he was more than excited. Another factor that increased his interest in the acquisition was the faintly repellent magnetic quality which emanated from it. It was something altogether too palpable to be dismissed as a figment of the imagination, yet hardly strong enough to attempt to identify or even describe. Some new element, Elton informed me positively. Some sort of radioactive substance. Never felt anything like it before. This is a real find, old man. Just wait, and you'll see history in the making when I analyze it. Presently, the thing reposed on the floor of the big, brightly lit laboratory. Elton took a few photographs from different angles, then set the camera away with an oddly puzzled look on his face. "Have you noticed this, Creighton?" he inquired, pointing to a section of the meteorite. I had observed the peculiarity of which he spoke, but my lack of familiarity with things scientific had prevented any comment. Briefly, it was this. While the meteorite seemed to be composed of solid rock, now that the black crust had been scraped away, we could see, inset on one side, a slab of what looked like some unfamiliar greenish metal. Its margins were so clearly defined as to give an impression of artificiality to its presence. "You think that's the new element you spoke of?" I asked. "Maybe. Anyway, it's unlike any metal I know of. But, if you've noticed, you can touch the meteorite anywhere and get that sensation. Whatever is giving it off may be part of the substance of the stone itself. However, that's something I'll have to determine by analysis. Help me put it under the rock grinder, Jenkins. I want some dust to work with." I glanced half-humorously at my wristwatch. It was nearly midnight, but my friend was in no mood to postpone his investigations. With Jenkins' help, he clamped the stone in position on the low platform of the big rock grinder, a relic of his transitory interest in geology which had stood idle for years in a corner of the room. He was promptly fussing with the grinder's long-unused electrical connections. He hooked them to a motor which the laboratory boasted, and, by some unfortunate chance, succeeded in obtaining a complete circuit at once. The motor began to hum, and the high-speed rotating grinding disc started its flashing revolutions. Elton threw a lever, and the disc began a slow descent. We stood back to escape the flying particles which would result from its contact with the meteorite. It reached the stone, and a grinding noise, like the sound of a dentist's drill tremendously amplified, rose above the drone of the motor. The surface of the mass began to level off beneath the friction. Then I stared in amazement at an unexpected development. The grinding disc had broken through a cortex. The meteorite was hollow. Elton leaped to the switch and shut off the power while I stepped over to inspect the hole. The opening exposed was small, but I could see that the interior was much larger and filled with a brilliant, pulsating light. A wave of intense heat swept up into my face, and I backed away, astonished and perplexed. Then a strange thing happened. From the small, jagged opening issued a radiant vapor of some luminous substance which seemed strangely cohesive in its nature, although it rose like a gas. It billowed up from the hole and expanded into a dense fiery ball, like a sphere of molten metal, perhaps 3 feet across and shimmering with unearthly luster. It floated in the air at the height of a man's head, a coruscating, brilliant thing, palpitating with an anomalous, vibrant life. It radiated heat, and we felt again the queer magnetic current, but now infinitely stronger. I edged further away, thoroughly bewildered and frightened, while Elton and Jenkins backed against the far wall, their fascinated gaze riveted on the weird phenomenon. Then it happened, with the speed of light. One moment the fiery mass was hovering lightly before the grinder. The next it had streaked across the intervening space like a scintillating bolt of lightning and wrapped the gardener round in lustrous, amorphous folds. Elton shouted something unintelligible, then raced across the room to the desk where he kept his pistol. I stood rooted in my tracks, stunned with surprise and horror. Jenkins was enveloped in a molten, glowing garment which covered him from head to foot. He swayed, then crashed to the floor. In a few seconds, it seemed, the fiery substance withdrew its folds and rose again into the air, resuming its former spherical shape. It swung lightly above the motionless body, pulsating rapidly, while a deepening reddish tinge blended with the original white-hot hue. Then Elton was at my side, pumping shot after shot into it from his automatic, but the thing continued to hover over its victim, swaying slightly after each report, yet apparently unharmed by the impacts of the heavy bullets which crashed on into the wall behind it. The pistol became silent, but the menacing swinging motion of the unholy creature continued. A warning struck into my dazed brain. I have seen a tiger lash its tail rhythmically with just that effect before its spring. I grasped Elton's arm and dragged him back in desperate haste. "Get away quick," I gasped, as I urged him back. "It's going to attack again." Only one way of retreat lay open. The thing's position cut off escape through the doors, and we fled towards the small storeroom opening off the far end of the laboratory. Only a second or two could have elapsed in our wild dash to this refuge, but as we crashed through its door, I saw, over my shoulder, the fiery globe streaking towards us with incredible speed. We slammed the door, and I drove home the bolt. At the same instant, a thud sounded against the outside, and a lurid, glowing curtain spread itself over the glass which occupied the upper panel of the door. Soul-shaking, sucking sounds came through the thin wood, and a wave of heat crept into the little room. Saved by water. I realized at once that we were trapped. The storeroom was little more than a cubbyhole used for the storing of bulky chemicals and odds and ends of discarded equipment from the laboratory. There was no window, no means of egress but the door, and if the weird menace could gain entrance, we would be helpless to escape it. I crouched against the far wall, my eyes glued in a helpless, fascinated stare on the crimson threat which blotted out our view of the laboratory. We were safe for the moment, but glass and wood seemed poor barriers against such an abnormal creation. For all we knew, it might possess other powers than those it had displayed, such as penetrating through certain kinds of solids, or perhaps the terrific heat of its presence would melt the glass. Already the temperature of the cramped space was rising rapidly, and we were drenched with perspiration. Then another source of danger appeared. In the light of the unshaded bulb which Elton had snapped on, I saw a thin wisp of smoke curling into the storeroom from between the door and its jamb. Apparently the heat pressed against the outside was igniting the wood. Elton was poking about in the miscellaneous junk piled around the room's sides. Now he stooped and snaked out a length of old rubber hose. He measured it with his eye and nodded. "I've got an idea," he announced. "Look at that door," I broke in. "Ideas won't help in another minute. The place will be on fire." He cast a startled glance over his shoulder as a puff of white smoke burst in upon us, followed by the crackling of flames from without as the fire gained a hold. With desperate speed, he fitted one end of the hose over the mouth of the water faucet above the mop sink at the side of the room. Dimly divining his intention, I held it in place. He opened the transom over the door ever so slightly, and thrust the other end of the tubing far enough through the crack to point downwards on the outside. "I don't know if this will do any good, Creighton," he muttered as he worked. "We can only try." Then, "Turn the water on full force. Quick." The glass was cracking in the heat as I turned the handle. A stream of icy water gushed down and deluged the horror which clung outside. Suddenly the glass was clear, and through the cascading water, I saw the creature, now a shapeless, tentacled mass, swirling and twisting violently about the laboratory, a cloud of steam surrounding it. The water continued to course down the outside of the door, and clouds of smoke arose as the fire was extinguished. A good part of the fumes worked their way into the storeroom and set us coughing and choking, but the discomfort passed unnoticed. We watched anxiously as the ruddy monster pursued its wild gyrations outside, then felt all the relief of death sentences reprieved as it suddenly flashed through one of the open windows and away into the night, as though sucked up by some cosmic draught. Thankfully, we pulled back the door and stumbled from the suffocating place into the cleaner air of the laboratory where the breeze from the open windows was rapidly dissipating the smoke. A glance at the burned and blackened woodwork, and we made our way to where Jenkins had fallen. He lay flat on his back, a ghastly sight. Through the charred shreds of clothing adhering to the cooked flesh, I could see that his entire body was scorched and blackened. The balls of his eyes were seared by the heat of the fiery shroud which had enveloped him, and his whole frame was strangely shriveled and shrunken. He must have died instantly, yet a more frightful death could scarcely be imagined. Elton stared at the shocking remains of his old employee, with mounting horror in his eyes. I felt very near collapse as I regarded the fate we had so narrowly escaped. At length, "Every drop of blood seems to have been drained from his body," muttered the scientist unbelievingly. I felt a nauseated understanding of the deepening crimson hue which had marked the creature as it rose from its victim. An hour later, Sheriff Hugh Walters stood looking down at the body of Jenkins, and the colour slowly ebbed beneath his rich mahogany tan. The puzzled skepticism which I had seen in his eyes, as he listened in the library to the outline of the evening's happenings, had vanished. He turned abruptly away. "This is bad business, Professor," he stated tritely. "I've seen some awful sights since I've been on this job, but nothing like this." He passed through the laboratory to the storeroom and looked inside, his keen, casual-seeming glance taking in each detail. "You're sure this thing is alive?" he asked as we started back to the library. "Couldn't it be some sort of electrical power gone wrong?" Elton shook his head emphatically. "No such luck. I thought of something of the sort at first, but every move it made was proof, not only of life, but of intelligence. No, we've got a mighty dangerous creature to combat, a devilish thing which has no right to existence on this earth." Walter settled his long, rangy frame in one of the library chairs and began to chew on a fresh cigar. "You think, then," he began, "that it's apt to attack others?" Elton turned in his restless pacing. "I'm almost sure of it. I'll admit there's a possibility that conditions of temperature and atmosphere here may prove unsuitable for it. It may try to return to its original habitat, or it may die, but I don't think we can depend on it. We should take steps at once to protect people. The fact that we found it sealed in the meteorite," he continued, "is most significant. I found that the metal slab which was set into the stone was put there to seal shut an opening. It was fused with the rock at the edges, inside and out. I believe this means that some form of intelligence, possibly on some distant planet, found the creature a menace, imprisoned it, and set it adrift in space, probably because they lacked the means of destroying it outright. And it looks bad for our chances of killing it, if a science capable of capturing the thing and projecting it into space was still unable to do so." He resumed his interminable pacing about the room, while the sheriff and I digested this thought. "What's your theory about its physical nature?" I asked presently. He pondered for a moment. "I think it's probably a combination of pure force, perhaps electrical in character, and attenuated substance. A creature absolutely alien to life as we know it. The substance is there because it absorbed the blood from Jenkins' body." The sheriff made a wry face. "But it wasn't dense enough to offer resistance to my bullets. There's a theory out now that all life originally evolved from heat, probably as good a guess as any. Perhaps this thing was spawned by some world in the outer reaches of space, or closer, for that matter. But speculation won't help us any on that point." "Funny sort of creature," commented Walters, as the other paused. "If your gun wouldn't hurt it, how are we going to go about killing it if it starts to make trouble?" "That's just the point I'm trying to bring out," returned my friend with a touch of irritation. "It's going to be a problem. But substance can be destroyed, any substance, if the right means is used." Water made it retreat, but I doubt if it would actually destroy it. High-powered projectiles, explosives. Fire might do it if the heat could be made sufficiently intense, or a high-voltage charge of electricity. But those are all pretty hard to bring into action against anything that moves so fast, and none of them are certain because we know so little of its nature. Walters looked discouraged. A little more talk and he rose to his feet. "I'll be out again in the morning," he told us. "There's nothing I can do tonight. We'll talk it over again then, and decide on some plan if it seems necessary." The chase begins. The morning was far advanced when I awoke from the heavy slumber, shot with gruesome dreams, into which I had sunk on retiring. I hurried down to the dining room and saw with relief that Elton had just taken his seat. He was sipping his coffee as he unfolded the late edition of the morning paper. I dropped down across from him and began to attack such portions of the meal as had appeared. His startled gasp interrupted me. I looked up to see him staring at the front page of the paper, his face quite white. In almost a single movement, I was around the table and peering over his shoulder at the item designated by his finger. Obviously a last-minute insert. It read, "An unidentified airmail pilot crashed early this morning in a field 3 miles west of Clinton. The plane and body were found shortly after daylight by searchers who had heard the crash. The appearance of the body will provide a puzzle for examining physicians. While almost every inch of the skin had been badly burned, no traces of fire were found in the plane, which, with the mail, was intact, aside from damage caused by the fall. The Sheriff's Department is conducting an investigation, and it is intimated that the cooperation of federal operatives is expected." A brief, unadorned story, plainly shorn of detail to make the edition, but it gripped my mind as a superlative horror. My thoughts reverted to the murderous space traveler. What malignant, rapacious entity from the boundless depths of space had we loosed on the world? Like the genie in the fable, it had been bottled up and helpless. In all innocence, we had brought about its release, and now it was beginning the nightmare career of preying on humanity which Elton had feared. I stumbled back to my seat. My friend continued to stare at the article, his lips pressed into a thin line. At length, he folded the paper carefully and laid it aside, then turned to me. "Just what I was afraid of. Creighton. The thing has struck again. Lord only knows how many victims it will claim before we can destroy it, and I'm responsible for it all." A haunted, remorseful look had come into his eyes. "You're not to blame," I told him quickly. "No one could have dreamed that such a thing was possible, and you acted in good faith when you brought the meteorite here and opened it. You're not at fault, at least not intentionally." "No, of course not," he returned quickly, suddenly recovering his usual vigorous outlook. "But I did the damage and I'll undo it. Somehow, I'm going to destroy that creature if it's the last thing I ever do. And I'll help you all I can," I assured him warmly. "I'll stay on here until it's killed. Between us, we may be able to trap it. At least we know more about it than anyone else." Similar reports began to fill the press, and terrible days followed. Corpses were found in isolated places each morning, always in the same condition. Burned, blackened, shriveled, every drop of blood extracted from their bodies. Automobiles were discovered wrecked and twisted along the highways, no trace of fire about them, unless perhaps a slight charring of the upholstery, but with their drivers done to death in the same frightful manner. Always the horror struck at night. Always the victims were alone, and there were few who laid eyes on it and lived to tell of what they saw. Warnings were issued by the state government. Everyone, especially those residing beyond the confines of towns and cities, was urged to remain indoors at night. Strong parties of state police, sheriff's deputies, and volunteers scoured the territory in which the deaths took place, patrolling the highways at night and searching for a possible hiding place of the creature by day. The horror seemed to confine its depredations to an area of approximately 100 square miles about Professor Elton's estate, and this gave hope, at first, that its lair might be located without much difficulty. But, as day followed day without progress, and the monster continued to prey unseen and unrestrained upon its victims, we began to despair. That was a period of nightmare existence. All the everyday pursuits, all the commonplace routine of life, were forgotten in the fight to check the ravages of the visitant from the voids of space. My readers will recall that the press of the world was filled with lurid accounts of the strange form of life which was devouring the blood of unfortunate men. They called it the cosmic horror and printed long speculations and scientific comments regarding its origin and nature. Professor Elton became the target for acrimonious criticism from certain of his colleagues for his unconventional action in appropriating the meteorite for his own use, it being suggested that had the stone been mounted in some museum, as would ordinarily have been its fate, the horror might never have escaped. All this was beside the point, but it preyed on Elton's mind, and he devoted himself grimly to plans to undo the damage. We spent the days conferring with various officials, trying to devise action to end the reign of terror which had developed in the region. The nights we passed usually with Sheriff Walters, cruising about the district in a cabin plane borrowed from the county airport. Walters had thrown himself unreservedly into the fight, and had collected and carried in the plane every modern means of destruction which had been suggested by science to combat the creature. In addition to a machine gun, synchronized to pour its deadly stream of lead between the whirling propeller blades, we carried a supply of hand grenades, 2 vicious submachine guns shooting explosive bullets, and sticks of special dynamite with detonator caps attached. Finally, there was a pressure tank of water with a hose, to be used in defense if that should prove necessary. But, though we roved the heavens night after night, while automobile loads of officers patrolled the roads below, the creature eluded us. Its continued presence in the locality was evidenced only by fresh victim or victims found each morning. It seemed to possess an uncanny faculty for distinguishing between its helpless prey and the hunters, some of whom traveled alone as decoys, and of keeping hidden from sight except when actually striking. The governor of the state was on the verge of declaring martial law in the district when the 10th night passed with no casualty reported on the following day. The populace throughout the area was thoroughly frightened, indeed panic-stricken, and was heeding the repeated warnings of the authorities. Sheriff Walters was jubilant when Elton and I met him that evening at the airport, preparatory to taking off for the night's patrol. "It means the thing didn't get any food last night," he explained, as he made an unusually careful, last-minute inspection of his arsenal inside the plane. "It's probably good and hungry by now, and maybe it'll get desperate and attack us. If it does, well, we'll find out what all this stuff here will do to it." He grinned hopefully as he took his place beside Elton and myself in the rear section of the ship's cabin. Walters was brave enough. He welcomed the prospect of coming to grips with the creature, but then he had never seen it in action. Besides the 3 of us in the rear, the plane carried its pilot and a deputy, also a flyer, who occupied the other front seat. Spread before us in the back section were the weapons we hoped to use. We took off smoothly as the late dusk deepened into night, and the lights of Clinton began to twinkle out. The breathless heat of the evening was relieved by a fresh breeze as we spiraled up to 1,000 feet, then leveled off for the long leisurely cruise. A higher altitude, Walters felt, would put us at too great a disadvantage if we were to surprise the creature in the act of attacking a person on the ground. Hour after hour slipped by while we maintained the routine vigil. It had resolved itself into a monotonous, wearisome task of late, but this night I had an uneasy foreboding that action was coming at last. As the sheriff had said, it seemed logical that the creature might adopt bolder tactics. The full moon rose, flooding the landscape below with a far-flung silver glory. At length, it passed behind a bank of clouds, and the chill of approaching dawn crept into the air. I was glancing at my watch when Elton suddenly gripped my arm. "Off to the left there, about the same height we are. See it?" I did. A gleaming point of light in the distance, larger than a star, and growing rapidly. It bore down on us with terrific speed, looming large and menacing in seconds. "Quick, boys," ordered Walters. "Up with those windows, close them all tight." As he spoke, he lifted one of the submachine guns while Elton took the other. On the far side, I followed the example of the men in front, sliding up my glass, so that now the only avenue open to attack was the window beside the sheriff. Another low-voiced command, and the pilot throttled the ship down to even slower speed. Walters was giving the creature every encouragement, but I think, too, that he had some idea of slower speed rendering our offense more effective. Then, like a streaking ball of fire, the horror was upon us, swooping out of the dark straight for the open window. The 2 machine guns roared side by side across the window ledge, pouring a steady stream of bullets at the onrushing creature. Abruptly, it checked its charge and began to swing along even with the plane, behind the end of the wing and within 20 feet or so of the window. There was no missing the glittering target. The high explosive projectiles tore through and through its tenuous form. meeting enough resistance from it to explode in a cracking roar of sound. But the thing continued to maintain its position, floating along at the same distance from the ship. Walters flung his gun aside. No use. Bullets won't hurt the damn thing. Give me the grenades. The thing attacks. I passed him the opened box of percussion hand grenades. They, too, met sufficient resistance to make them detonate, and he hurled them, one after the other. The margin of safety was slight. Had the target been closer to ourselves or to the wingtip, we would not have dared to use them. The night was filled with crashing detonations, and flaming explosions blended with the sheen of the creature and wiped it from our sight for long seconds. Walters concluded his onslaught with the special, straight nitroglycerin dynamite, and the plane rocked as the rending concussions blasted the air. But the creature still swept along beside us when he stopped. It was weaving about, stretching out loathsome little feelers of light, as though to learn the nature of the noise and flashes. Apparently, the terrific disintegrating powers of the explosives had not affected it in the slightest. "Good Lord, it's indestructible," exclaimed Elton harshly, and indeed it seemed that modern science lacked the means to end this life from the voids of space. The most powerful short-range weapons at our command had failed against it. And now, seeming to recover from its surprise at the strange reception, or perhaps sensing that no more entertainment was to be offered, it returned to its original purpose of attack. Slowly it drew towards the window, closer and closer. Walters awoke to the danger. He turned up the glass and shouted to the pilot, "Give her all you can. Jack, we've got to get away." The man opened his throttle wide. The heavy ship gathered speed and vibrated in every part as it roared through the darkness. For a moment, the gleaming menace dropped behind. Then, with incredible swiftness, it was abreast of us again, and curving in under the wing, had landed with a heavy jar against the pilot's window, where it spread and covered the glass, a molten-hued, pulsating amorphity. The flyer gave one frightened look, then turned his head away, wide-eyed fear stamped on his face. The horror maintained its hold on the glass with ease, and now, in the light from the cabin, I saw the means. Countless little tentacles projected from the main body, pressing against the transparent surface to somehow create the necessary suction. There was something infinitely repulsive in the rapacious, alien intelligence displayed by the creature, and I shuddered as I watched. Elton was working with deft haste at the attachments of the water-filled pressure tank, something we had never thought to use. He dared not open the window against which the creature had spread itself. After having seen it pour through the small hole in the meteorite like a gas, we knew this was too desperate an expedient. Instead, he thrust himself in beside the pilot, opening the small front window slightly from the top. A veritable gale from the propeller swept into the cabin. Elton slipped the nozzle of the hose through the opening and directed it around the corner, pointing down the side of the plane. At his signal, I turned the valve, and a rush of water foamed along the ship's side and back into the night. But the horror continued to cling in spite of it. Perhaps the water was too diffused, coming in too fine a spray due to the ship's motion to affect it. Perhaps the thing itself was too hungry to care about discomfort. At any rate, the small tank had emptied almost before we realized it, and Elton closed the glass, his face a study in puzzled desperation. The tentacles fascinated me. The creature covered the entire window, its flattened body overlapping onto the structure of the ship. I noticed now that the tentacles clinging to the glass were stretching and contracting, stretching and contracting. Suddenly, in a flash of understanding, I knew what the movement meant. The creature was exerting a vicious effort of suction against the glass, at the same time holding its position by maintaining a grip on the plane's frame. Even as comprehension flooded my mind, its purpose was achieved. A tinkle of broken glass sounded above the bellow of the motor, and a jagged piece of window came away in the grip of the tentacles. Instantly, the creature was flowing through the opening. The pilot, his face contorted with terror, half rose to fling himself back, but swift as thought the horror struck. The man stood for a moment, wrapped in a sheet of living, vibrant flame, then collapsed to lie motionless across his seat. The evil, magnetic aura filled the ship, palpable as an electric current, and heat from its presence beat upon us. Elton jerked an automatic from his pocket and sent a stream of lead into the recumbent form. Whether he was making a final, close-range attack on the creature, or whether his object was to give a quick and painless death to its victim, I never asked. The body jerked spasmodically under the impact of the steel-jacketed bullets, but I have always liked to believe that men died at the first touch of that scintillating doom. As the bark of the pistol ceased, the frightful repast was finished. Slowly the horror flowed up from its prey and resumed its normal spherical shape, while the remains of the pilot slumped, blackened and lifeless, across the leather seat. The creature hovered lightly in the narrow space, palpitating rapidly, while the revolting crimson glow spread through it. The plane rushed unguided through the darkness, held to its course by the automatic stabilizing power of its design. The deputy had crawled back and crouched at my feet, his face a mask of fright. We stared in horrid fascination at the evilly glowing sphere in which the shades of crimson played and melted, absorbing and obliterating the hungry molten hue. My eyes wavered for a moment, and I noted with an odd, subconscious detachment that, in this moment of supreme stress, the sheriff's jaws still clamped mechanically on his dead cigar, though his face was ashy beneath its tan. If the thing chose to attack, nothing could save us. And the wish rose in me for a clean death, if I must die. My gaze still riveted on the balefully shimmering monster, I leaned toward the dynamite, resolved to blow the ship and all its cargo of human life to eternity before submitting to that foul embrace. But, as my hand trembled on the brink of destruction, reprieve came. Slowly the creature swirled to the window and slipped through the jagged opening like a lambent, gleaming serpent. Outside it reformed and shot away, downward, and on a tangent to our course. In half a minute it had disappeared as though passing behind some obstruction. The moon's rays burst suddenly through the scudding clouds, lighting up the landscape below. The sheriff brushed a hand across his eyes, and the dazed look began to die out of them. He glanced around. Then, "Bob," he called sharply. "Bob, get up and take those controls." The brusque tone penetrated the cloud of fright which numbed the deputy's mind. His face became more composed as he crawled over to his seat, carefully avoiding contact with the body of the flyer, and grasped the control stick. During the past few moments, my gaze had rested on the silver terrain below with an odd, detached sense of familiarity. Something was striving to come to the front of my mind, that long rampart of hills, fishing excursions, motor trips. I had been over every foot of them. Suddenly, I knew. "Elton," I exclaimed, "did you notice where the thing disappeared?" They both turned and looked at me, puzzled. "That line of hills," I continued. "It never rose above them. Don't you know what's there?" I wanted to test my theory, as well as my knowledge of local geography, by getting their reaction before I divulged it. Walters still looked blank, but, after a long glance downwards, understanding broke over Elton's face. "Dinosaur cave, you mean?" "Of course. It couldn't have gone anywhere else when it vanished the way it did. That's where it's been hiding by day. It must be." Grim exultation shone from his eyes as he turned to meet the sheriff's corroborative nod. Dinosaur cave, that endless ramification of gloomy caverns stretching back and down beneath the hills to unguessed depths. I remembered a report by one of Walter's assistants, mentioning a cursory examination of this cave as part of a routine hunt through the several similar formations in the district. Nothing suspicious had been found, and no more comprehensive examination was made at the time, owing, I suppose, to the physical difficulties of covering so vast a space. Dawn was breaking as the deputy brought our ship to rest in a ploughed field. He was far too shaken to remain at the controls for the flight back to the airport. Indeed, we were fortunate in achieving a safe landing at all, for, as the plane rolled to a stop, he fell forward in a dead faint. The desperate effort. We had scarcely reached home when Elton plunged into a fever of activity. Visitors, long-distance calls, telegrams. I marveled at the man's tireless vitality as he brought his plans to completion. I crept away for a few hours' rest. He had promised to call me in time for the final act of our battle against the horror, and I threw myself across the bed, fully clothed, to drop almost instantly into a heavy sleep. The sun was dropping in the west when he shook me awake. "Walters and I are going in alone," he explained, as I hastily gulped a cup of coffee. A mob of men in that cave would spoil any chance of catching the creature unawares. Then we were roaring along the concrete in the big police sedan, driven by one of Walter's deputies with the sheriff beside him. On the rear seat, carefully placed between Elton and myself, was a large crated wax container filled with anhydrous hydrofluoric acid, which had been shipped by air express from the city that morning. "I don't know whether it will do the job or not," Creighton, the scientist, admitted with a tired smile as we purred along. "Hydrofluoric acid is the most deadly stuff known to science. Like fluorine, its base, it attacks almost all known substances violently. Many of them it ignites spontaneously. After our failure last night, I decided that chemicals were our only recourse. All other weapons had proved worthless. So we have the acid and this." He drew forth a strange-looking weapon, a sort of long pistol with an overdeveloped midsection and a huge bore. "Something new from the secret arsenal of the War Department," he explained, meeting my wondering gaze. "It shoots a good-sized capsule of trinitrotoluene, TNT. The chamber holding the capsule has a heating element built into it which will melt the TNT in 3 seconds. The discharge is affected by compressed air, and it has an accurate range up to 100 feet. The Secretary of War sent it by special plane after I talked to him on the telephone this morning." I stared. "But how do you expect to use them?" "I don't know. I'm staking everything on taking the creature unawares, and on these things being able to definitely affect it. A long chance, Creighton. If I only knew the chemical nature of that part of the creature which is real substance, I could tell how it would react. But I don't, and I'm not likely to get an opportunity to analyze it, so I'm taking a chance. Walters wants to go along and help, but you're not going into the cave. You'll wait outside with the deputy, and if we're not back by 7 o'clock, you can report us missing. But don't look for us till morning." I stared at him coldly. "If you think I'm going to sit safely outside while you go in there, perhaps to your death, you're crazy. I'm going along and do what I can to help." His keen eyes probed into mine. Then the grim set lines of his face softened. "Of course you can come with us, old man," he exclaimed, an odd embarrassment in his voice. "We've faced it together so far, and we'll finish together if you say so. I knew you'd want to come, but I honestly wish you wouldn't. You see, Walters has his duty as an officer to consider, and I have the responsibility for having started the trouble. But you have no obligation in the matter, and it smacks almost of suicide for you to join us." "Forget it, Elton," I ordered gruffly. Now the car slowed down, then turned off into a tortuous, rutted dirt road. I knew it for the little-used lane which ran past the mouth of Dinosaur Cave, and recognition brought an apprehensive thrill. Steadily the car mounted along the winding path, leaving the ploughed lands behind and entering a region of rank vegetation sprouting unchecked along the road. The hills towered to our right, intercepting the slanting rays of the sun, and to the left the ground fell away, behind a dense tangle of shrubbery, to the tilled fields below. At length, we rounded a bend and the black mouth of the cave, overhung with an unwholesome-looking network of vines and creepers, opened from the hillside. The car pulled off onto the uneven, grass-grown shoulder. "Here we are, sir," announced the deputy, ill-concealed nervousness in his voice. We got out, Elton handling the wax jug carefully. With a screwdriver, he removed the wooden crating, and we were ready. "Wait till 7 o'clock. Barnes, no later," instructed the sheriff. "That will give you time to get to my office before dark. We'll be back here by then unless we decide to spend the night inside," he added, with grim humor. The man nodded and settled back in his seat. Walters picked up the wax flask by its inset handle, and we pushed aside the growth about the opening and entered the cavern. A wave of dank, faintly stirring air met us like a blow in contrast to the warm summer afternoon we had left. It struck a chill into my body and a sense of foreboding to my heart. Elton drew a flashlight from his pocket and sent a cone of cold illumination through the gloom. In a sweeping circle, he revealed the uneven rock floor, strewn with dead leaves and mold near the entrance, and the rough walls and vaulted ceiling. The cave was about 20 feet wide at its start and ran back into the mounting hills like a natural tunnel. Its branches and ramifications were endless, as I have said before, and it had never been extensively explored because there had never been anything especially interesting about it. Even its name, so far as I could discover, had no basis in fact. Where the branching galleries led, or in what part the horror might lurk, no one could say. As we continued, I began to feel that it was a desperate, all but hopeless venture. We picked our way carefully over a floor which became littered with broken stone as we penetrated deeper. The entrance dwindled to a point of light far in the rear, and we began to pass the mouths of smaller tunnels, opening black and mysterious off the main artery. I wondered again how Elton expected to locate the creature in this underground maze. We had progressed for perhaps 20 minutes, in dead silence, when we came to a branching of the main passage. The fork to the left continued on into blackness at our own level, but the one on the right began a definite downward trend at the point of divergence, as I could see in the wavering rays of the electric torch. Unhesitatingly, Elton chose this path. We entered a narrowing, descending passage where shadows flickered weirdly on walls covered with moisture. The dampness in the air became more noticeable, and from far ahead, I heard the trickle of running water. Down, down. Walters came to an abrupt stop. "Elton," he protested in a guarded whisper, "I think it's foolish to go any deeper into this shaft. It'll be dark outside before we know it. The thing will start on its regular nightly hunt, and we'll be trapped. I didn't think 3 of us could find it. These caves are too big." Elton did not answer. From far in the distance ahead, there came a faint rustling sound, as of some leathery substance brushing or dragging against the rocky surface. We listened intently. The noise stopped. Then, "No, Walters, I'm still playing my hunch. I'm going straight ahead. We'll turn back in time to get out before dark if we don't find it, but I think we're on the right track." The sheriff grumbled to himself, and we started again. The tunnel broadened out presently, and, so far as I could judge, proceeded on a nearly horizontal plane. The ceiling rose, the walls fell away from the flashlight's radius, and the unseen dimensions of the place impressed me as huge. Then, through the damp air with its taint of mold and corruption, floated that repellent, magnetic current which we had come to associate with the close presence of the horror. Elton made a satisfied sound, and we pressed forward cautiously along the lane of light from his lamp. Again, our ears caught that faint, rustling sound. Still ahead, but much nearer. Elton stopped and snapped off the flashlight. Darkness wrapped us like a tangible thing. The silence was absolute. Here, then, in the very bowels of the earth, far below the clean air and sunshine of the world of men, the foul enormity must lie hidden, waiting for nightfall before coming forth on another raid to satisfy its ravenous appetite. As my eyes grew accustomed to the Stygian blackness, I discerned ahead, and to our right, a ghostly glimmer, more like a dim phosphorescent glow than a light. With infinite care, we picked our way soundlessly through the dank gloom, the magnetic current growing ever stronger. We rounded a bend in the cavern's wall and stopped before the source of the light, the mouth of a roomy, rock-bound alcove opening off the main artery. Within lay a sight of soul-freezing horror, as alien to our earth as though we stood in the depths of some strange planet. The floor shelved downward from the opening, and along one side ran the blind brook we had heard from afar. The details of the place are vague in my mind, for my gaze was instantly held by the source of the faint glow which permeated the place. It was a great flat shape, porous and leathery, lying on the rocky floor on the far side of the chamber, and pulsating slowly and evenly. Even as we watched, it stirred slightly, and the dry rustle sounded, startlingly loud in this place of silence. It was the horror at rest. Around it clustered a group of similar flat shapes, but only a fraction of its size. All palpitated slowly, rhythmically, all emitted the same dim radiance. Dried excreta, very like the droppings of birds, littered the floor, and a nameless odor joined the overpowering magnetic emanation. "Good God," breathed Elton from beside me. "The thing has propagated, a devil's spawn from hell, waiting to get loose on the whirl." His whispered words held uncontrollable loathing. I made no reply. I was too shaken by that abominable sight. Then Walters stirred, cautiously, restlessly. A pebble, dislodged by his groping foot, came loose and rattled down into the alcove. Instantly, the flat leathern growths began to fill out, began to glow more and more brilliantly. A weird effulgence filled the chamber and eerie shadows quivered on the walls. My heart pumped furiously, and my muscles tensed, as the parent creature, wide awake and ready for action, swelled into the glittering globular shape we had come to know so well and floated lightly into the air. Elton drew the trinitrotoluene pistol from his pocket and pressed the small lever which actuated the heating element. "You first, Walters," he grated between clenched teeth. "Aim at that knob of rock above it, then run like hell." The horror began to sway. It was as though a great molten ball was suspended by a chain and swinging slowly in short arcs. The preliminary to its flashing attack, its offspring clustered beneath it on the floor, blasphemous little spheres of potential destruction. The time was ripe. I stood back out of the way. Walters hurled the wax jug of hydrofluoric acid straight at a projecting point of rock above the creature. The flask shattered to bits, and the horror beneath was sprayed with the deadly stuff. For once, man's quickness had outmatched its own. As I watched, flames burst from it, the clean flames of real combustion. Then came a hissing of air beside me as Elton fired the pistol. I had a glimpse of the chamber, a flame-filled inferno. Then the terrific rending power of the TNT had brought down the roof. It collapsed with a series of hollow booming roars, and the visitor from space, with its foul progeny, was buried under tons of shattered rock. We had leaped back into the main tunnel to crouch behind a jagged outcropping of the cavern's floor. Flying fragments filled the air, and the force of the concussions shook the cave and flattened us behind our rampart. A stench unbearable issued from the direction of the monster's lair. When the dust and smoke and fumes had cleared away, we saw that the mouth of the chamber was sealed to its roof by a great pile of crushed and broken stone which flowed far out into the main cavern. We turned away. In our hearts welled relief and thankfulness too great for words as, shaken, bruised, and blackened, we began the long walk back through the darkness to the world of light and men, the world we had perhaps saved from ultimate destruction by a constantly multiplying band of nightmare horrors. End of The Cosmic Horror by Richard F. Searight. This is the end of the story. Tell us what you think in the comments section. Please subscribe and ring the notification bell so you'll be the first to know when we release new content. If you want to support us, consider joining our channel membership. You will get instant early access to more than 100 stories before their release. This is the only way to support our channel.